One of my biggest concerns, perhaps my biggest concern with Labour and foreign policy, is China. And I don't think enough has been made of it actually. I'm going to read out a piece from The Guardian, but I know the Daily Telegraph was leading on this yesterday. Now, I don't like everything the Daily Telegraph comes out with. I'm very, very critical of their extreme pro Israel bias. However, Labour should come under scrutiny for their frankly, appeasement of China. It's deeply concerning. I would go so far as to say it's a national security threat, and it needs a lot more scrutiny. If Kemi Badenoch hammers the government on this, that would be justified and should be doing her job. Not that the Tory record is perfect either, but I'm going to read out the report. I think it's quite troubling, the implications involved. This is from The Guardian and it was posted um, 7 hours ago. China threatened to retaliate against UK over foreign influence rules. This report's by Elena Correa and Dan Sabak. That's Sabbagh. China threatened to retaliate against the UK government if ministers targeted parts of its security apparatus under foreign influence rules, The Guardian can disclose. Chinese officials warned the Foreign Office that the move would have negative consequences for relations soon after The Guardian reported it was under consideration, according to two government sources with knowledge of the discussions. The disclosure will raise alarm bells, given that ministers have so far refused to apply stricter foreign influence rules on lobbyists acting for China or any part of the Chinese state. Only Russia and Iran have been included on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, FIRS, which was introduced in July and came fully into force this month. FIRS requires anyone in the UK acting for a foreign power or entity to declare their activities to the government or face criminal sanctions. The enhanced tier covers countries and entities deemed a particular risk and requires extra disclosures. As a result, anyone doing undeclared work on behalf of Iran or Russia faces 5 years in prison. The Guardian reported in the spring that instead of targeting China as a whole, ministers were considering including specific parts of the Chinese political system that have been accused of interference in the West on the enhanced tier. Such entities include China's Ministry of State Security, which its intelligence service, the Chinese Communist Party, the United Front Work Department, which is often referred to as the international arm of the CCP, and the People's Liberation Army, which is China's military. The government insists that countries' designations and affairs are kept under review. The Foreign Office was contacted for comment. Ministers are under pressure concerning the consequences of the rapprochement with Beijing and are facing questions about the collapse of a trial of two Britons, including a former parliamentary researcher who were accused of spying for China. The trial of Christopher Cash, a former parliamentary aide to Conservative MPs Alicia Kearns and Tom Tugendhat, and his friend Christopher Berry. Those names, Alicia Kearns and Tom Tugendhat, they're on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which looks into China, so that's not insignificant, had been due to begin this month, but the case was suddenly dropped by the Crown Prosecution Service on the 15th of September. Cash and Berry denied the charges. And I'm just interjecting here, I know that Kearns and Tugendhat have been targeted by the Chinese state for their critique of the Chinese Communist Party. The Sunday Times and the Telegraph reported that the government's refusal to describe China as an enemy and witness evidence from a security official led to the case being abandoned. So you have a trial here for espionage in the UK, or national security, and the government's appeasing of China meant this trial collapsed. The implications are very serious. Jonathan Powell, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, said to have chaired a meeting in Whitehall last month where he told officials the government's evidence would stop well short of calling Beijing an enemy. Whitehall sources denied the claim that Powell was involved in restricting government evidence. The Sunday Times reported that Powell told the September meeting that additional evidence in the trial expected to be given by Matthew Collins, a Deputy National Security Advisor, would have to be based on Labour's new national security strategy published this year. That describes China as a geostrategic challenge and not an enemy. Cash and Berry has been accused of allegedly breaching the 1911 Official Secrets Act, which says that a person is guilty of spying if they pass on information that's directly or indirectly useful to an enemy. Government sources said that while the meeting involving Powell had taken place, it had been mischaracterised. They said it would not be possible to insist that Collins cite 2025 government policy when the alleged offences had taken place previously between 2021 and early 2023 when the Conservatives were in power. Collins had already been given written evidence that had been cited by the CPS in its initial summary of the case in April 2024, at which point the accused were said to have acted in a way prejudicial to the safety or interests of the UK by passing on information directly or indirectly useful to the Chinese state. Government sources said that no evidence put forward by the state was withdrawn or challenged and that no pressure of any kind was placed on the CPS. Collins' evidence was considered important because it would help spell out the impact any alleged espionage would have had. Cash worked as an aide to Kearns, a backbencher, and was accused of passing on information to Berry. She's a backbencher, but like I say, she was involved in the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which looked into China, and she has been targeted by the CCP. It's well known that British MPs have been targeted by these thugs in Beijing, and that's what I'm calling them. The CPS said, I'll read that out again. Cash worked as an aide to Kearns, a backbencher, and was accused of passing on information to Berry. The CPS said he in turn wrote up to 34 reports, at least some of which were about the British political system for a Chinese individual assessed to be a member of the country's intelligence services. The Guardian reported that Kai Chi, China's fifth most senior official, was believed to be in receipt of this intelligence. I'm not sure if he's a Politburo member, but clearly quite high up the security apparatus. Allies of Cash had indicated that while he did supply information to Berry, it was said to be public material on how Parliament or UK politics works, or his personal analysis such as who he thought would win the next general election. Berry's lawyers were expected to argue that he was working for a corporate client in China looking to expand in the UK. The CPS has said that the case had been kept under continuous review and that it was abandoned because the evidential standard was no longer met. On Sunday, officials pointed to a letter from Stephen Parkinson, the Director of Public Prosecutions, who had said in a letter to the Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp that prosecutors had not been subject to any disclosure or pressure by politicians in deciding to drop the case ahead of trial. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, told broadcasters that there would be no ministerial involvement in the collapse of the case. That's what she says. Senior Tories have accused the government of collapsing the trial to avoid upsetting China, although the Conservatives also declined to designate the country as a national security threat when they were in power. In the latest sign of warming relations with Beijing, The Guardian understands that a senior Foreign Office official met Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Commons Speaker, over the summer to discuss the prospect of lifting the ban on the Chinese ambassador entering Parliament in return for Beijing lifting its sanctions on UK parliamentarians. A string of high-level government figures have travelled to China on official visits since Labour came to power, including Peter Kyle, the Business Secretary for Trade Talks last month, and Powell, the National Security Advisor, over the summer. Keir Starmer is widely expected to make a bilateral trip to China early in the new year, though the timing may depend on Donald Trump, who has said he intends to visit early 2026. So this will be very clear, regardless of what the outcome of this espionage trial would have been. The Chinese state was massively culpable in the spread of COVID, and I don't think that's banging an old drum. 250,000 people died in this country, millions died around the world. Instead of treating that as a pandemic, they initially punished the whistleblowers. They threatened our close ally Australia for calling for an independent inquiry. They have engaged in bullying for years, certainly of small Pacific nation states, but even bigger countries. It's this wolf warrior thuggery coming from Beijing. When China demands respect, it doesn't seem to think it can show respect in return. I really, really have a problem with Labour's stance. Despite what they say, I think it's glaringly obvious that they've been going out of their way to pander to Beijing. I don't trust Labour on this. I really don't. Early in his premiership, Starmer did raise human rights concerns with Xi Jinping at the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, but that's okay, that's something, but we also have national security concerns. British MPs haven't just been sanctioned by Beijing, they've been threatened by Beijing. We have had successive governments have spoke about closing Confucius Institutes. That hasn't happened. Pretty much the rest of Europe has closed those because they're widely seen as a fifth column. Let's be clear what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a superpower that is not afraid to threaten, bully, intimidate, interfere. And I strongly believe in geopolitics, the only language that bullies understand is power. I think the strategy the Labour is taking of kind of trying to please Beijing and trying not to upset them. You know, they say that had nothing to do with the collapse of the trial. It's a bit like the mega embassy that was going to be built. So far, that seems to be in a hiatus, which is good. But again, Labour was dragging its feet on that. I'm sick and tired of British governments, and the Tories are not squeaky clean with this. I'm sick and tired of British governments being weak when it comes to China. I mean, if a small country like Lithuania can stand up to China, why the hell can the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland not stand up to China? We need to realise what they are. They're a thug regime that that values power for power's sake, and that is it. A brutal human rights record, of course, but also a national security threat. We've had numerous examples of Chinese espionage in this country. There was the woman who worked as a solicitor in Birmingham for a long time, and she was heavily involved in the Sino-British community, and she was accused of espionage by the security services. What I want to know is why Keir Starmer's government is ignoring the security services. Why is he showing such disregard to MI5? This idea that, you know, maybe Rachel Reeves thinks and Keir Starmer think that if we go easy on China, we'll get big trade deals with them. But is that a price worth paying for selling out on national security? I don't think that, you know, granted it would be big trade deals, probably in the billions. I don't think that's a price worth paying for compromising our national security. And it also puts us in a position whereby we could never, for example, we'd be compromising condemning China if they decided to invade Taiwan. Let's not forget the British government, at least the Conservative government, sanctioned Beijing over its brutal treatment of the Uyghurs. Those sanctions haven't been lifted, so what's Labour's stance on that? Are they going to lift those sort of sanctions in return for... There's no doubt Beijing will demand that. You know, I'm sick and tired of this idea that the only approach to a bully, and it could be argued with Trump as well, Starmer seems to think the only way we can deal with the two superpowers, the United States and China, is just be cautious and give them what they want. I don't agree with that. The United Kingdom's a great country, and we may not have the power of China or the United States, but we need to start being a bit more assertive, frankly. Now, the government has taken a different stance from Trump's administration on Israel and Gaza. Good. But when it comes to China, it just looks like appeasement, quite frankly. And, you know, the real question is what sort of things is Beijing going to demand? So temporarily, yeah, they might lift sanctions on those MPs, but there's still interference going on. You know, it's well known, I've said this before, that the Chinese Communist Party stokes up nationalism in its diaspora. So you get situations whereby Hong Kong students and others are threatened and bullied by mainland Chinese students. And, you know, if this sort of issue is raised, then the Chinese embassy just screams it's xenophobia. It's anti-Chinese racism. But the truth is, for a very long time now, China's been throwing its weight around. It's threatened our allies. It's interfered in Canada. It threatened Australia. This is a thug regime. The only thing the Communist Party cares about is power. You know, that's what we're dealing with. And it's not quite the same as the situation with Russia, because we're not talking about an actual armed conflict at this point. But what if things do escalate? What if China decides that the momentum has come and they decide to invade Taiwan? What stance is Keir Starmer's government going to take? Are they going to be passive and neutral? Or are they going to condemn China and expel the Chinese ambassador, which is what they should do? I just don't accept that because the Chinese economy is so big, we just have to give them what they want. And just, you know, well, we better not upset them. We could be shoring up trade deals with many other countries. I do not say that we completely 100% cut off ties with Beijing. That's not what I'm saying. But this plan for Starmer to go have a bilateral meeting with China as early as next year, we're talking only 4 years, 5 years, after 250,000 British citizens died from a pandemic that in large part spread because of the nature of that regime. The fact that instead of dealing with it as a localized epidemic, which it would have been, they punished whistleblowing doctors. Now, the narrative is you can't criticize the Chinese government because it was a virus. It was, no one could have controlled that. I don't agree with that. I think if the Chinese Communist Party had operated in a different way, they could have listened to those doctors, taken it seriously, and the entire world wouldn't have suffered. And it shows the power of China, the fact that they have effectively got away with it. The entire world suffered in 2020, 21, 22, and yet China's basically got away with it. I really think China should have been polarized at that time. The Chinese communist regime should have been polarized. And instead of doing that, the world got cold feet. Even Donald Trump, who has long been seen as a China hawk, even his record on this is inconsistent. He claims he has a great relationship with Xi Jinping, and the sanctions, or the tariffs on China are less than they are on India. And what does that say? So I'm kind of disgusted by the current government stance on China. Yvette Cooper needs to answer questions. Keir Starmer needs to answer questions. They need to explain. Rachel Reeves needs to answer questions. This is one area where I think Kimmy Badenoch can actually push the government hard. Like really, really push them in the Commons. Why are you appeasing China? Why are you not standing up to China? Why is it when British MPs have been threatened, you, Keir Starmer, are planning to visit this country, treating it like an old friend? It's just disgraceful. What makes me cringe is the idea of Xi Jinping getting a visit next year and setting foot on our soil, given everything that's happened. Now, China may not have invaded a country the way Russia has, but it's done pretty much everything else. And I think we need to get a backbone and put China on that list. Yes, there'll be reprisals. Yes, China will probably sanction British goods. Yes, they'll probably sanction British MPs. But, if that's the price to stand up to a bully, so be it. And make no mistake, the Chinese Communist Party are bullies and thugs and liars. As some people I know who are involved in the human rights sector have pointed out, this isn't about xenophobia. We can welcome Chinese tourists. We can even welcome Chinese business people to an extent, provided they don't have ties with the CCP. Although, you can't really get far in business in China without CCP ties. But there's just little things that build up. I remember when Brendan Kavanagh, the musician, was harassed by Chinese nationalists in London. And our Eustace police, instead of listening to both sides, they came and told him he couldn't say that and he couldn't. This was a public area and these students tried to silence him from performing a piano in a public area. One of them even yelled at him loudly. That's how these brats behave. I'm talking about some of the Chinese students here. I'm not talking about all of them, but frankly, some of them are wealthy sons and daughters of Communist Party officials, and they throw their weight around. They demand respect, but they don't show any in return. They need to be reminded that they're guests in this country, and they should damn well behave appropriately. They should have their visas threatened. I really have a big problem with, when we're looking at the issue of immigration and migrants, I wonder what stance reform will take. In the chance that reform probably has a strong chance of being the next government. I don't trust reform, but if they take a tough line on China, I'm not going to argue against that. It's one area which I would welcome. So I'd like to know what Nigel Farage's stance on this is. They only have 5 MPs, so they're not going to get many questions in Parliament. Kimmy Badenoch has to step up and ask Starmer why he's appeasing China. And specifically, what he's doing to stand up against him. And let's see how he answers. Because frankly, Keir Starmer is weak when it comes to China, and so is his government. It's actually, this is not a small thing. And, all we need to see is some major cybersecurity hack or something. I think what Badenoch needs to ask the Prime Minister is, why are you ignoring the security service? Why are you not taking a tougher line with China? Why are you disregarding the security services who have repeatedly warned about Chinese espionage? And the government, of course, is going to say, well, they're not going to admit that they are complicit in this pandering to China, but it's very clear that they are. They can say that they weren't responsible for the collapse of the trial, but why did it collapse? We're talking about a British citizen accused of espionage with a powerful, hostile foreign state, and the trial collapses. Why? I also think there's too many examples of espionage in this country where the suspect wasn't even arrested. They just seemingly went back to China, or there was no major follow-up on it. Why not? Remember, British MPs have been threatened. Human rights activists in this country have been threatened. Chinese dissidents have been threatened. This is a thug regime, and the only language they understand is force and power and bullying. Anyone who doubts that should look at the way the Chinese Foreign Ministry treats smaller countries it tries to stand up to it. They don't quite use that language with bigger countries, but they do it with smaller countries because they're bullies. It's a thug regime that's responsible for tens of millions of deaths in modern Chinese history. That's the reality. And we need to stop treating them like they're, some friend. They're not. I think we should work with them where absolutely necessary, perhaps on issues of climate change, perhaps in some trade areas, but really it should be not to the extent that Keir Starmer is pushing and Rachel Reeves is pushing. So if Reform is going to be the next government, Farage should be sensible, take a strong line on this, and along with the Tories, and the Liberal Democrats should be as well. If Ed Davey wants to be a strong leader, he needs to push the government on this. Why are they not standing up to China? Keir Starmer is showing himself to be weak on China, and it's yet another mistake of this government. It's infuriating, quite frankly.